Hello. This is episode 1 of Through Lidless Eyes Rewatch of Evangelion. Maybe I'll come up with some kind of humorous "you cannot blank" name. Haven't come up with it yet. So, about a month ago, the final film in the 4-part series, Rebuild of Evangelion, was released. I'm going to do a series of 4 sort of podcast-style recordings where I will watch each of the films, and then I will write down any thoughts I have, and I'll talk about them for a while. I don't know how long each of these are going to be. I expect that they will basically just be however long they need to be for me to express what I want to say. Evangelion 1.11, You Are Not Alone. It's like a decade and a half old now, and it's basically a shot-for-shot remake of a handful of episodes of TV that aired in the mid-90s. This is by far going to be the most sort of, it's the kind of thing that you kind of have to do as a formality, if you're talking about a series of films or television or something, is, like this is the anime equivalent, even arguably the Japanese culture equivalent of Star Wars. And what can be said about Star Wars that hasn't been said yet? I'm not a huge fan of movies, Like, there are not many art forms that I will intentionally seek out things that I don't think I will like. Like, I'm fine with playing a bad video game because I like video games enough that playing a bad one can help me develop a better understanding of why I like the things I do like. And I also feel that way about music, but that's about it. I've never really liked reading fiction. I do enjoy reading non-fiction, but it's primarily because, I suppose, if you find a particular non-fiction author that you like, you can be rather confident that pretty much everything they've written is going to be in a very similar style. With fiction, I think it's a lot more difficult. The point is, I'm the same way with movies. I don't like to watch movies that I'm not already confident that I will enjoy. Most of the movies that I have seen a lot, like several times, are movies that I do not enjoy. Most of them are Christmas movies, children's films, things like Finding Nemo, Elf. I'd never want to watch those movies ever again, as long as I live. And outside of films in that category, Evangelion 1.11, You Are Not Alone, is probably the film that I have seen the most times. When I was a teenager, my family would eat out once a week, And there was a pretty significant stretch of time where virtually every week we would all get basically the same order from Taco Bell. And after what felt like years, drinking Taco Bell's Mountain Dew Baja Blast flavor, because of course it's a Taco Bell exclusive flavor. If you're going to Taco Bell, you have to get it. It has virtually no flavor to me anymore. It's been a little while since I've had it. I probably have it on closer to an annual basis than a weekly basis now. But I don't know what it tastes like. I've had enough of it throughout my life that it's virtually indistinguishable from water. And that goes for a lot of other sodas, you know, Mountain Dew. It's not quite Baja Blast level. You know, it mostly just tastes like sugar. But it tastes like something. And that's kind of how I feel about Evangelion 1.11. You Are Not Alone. Is it's not quite Baja Blast. It doesn't just taste like water. It's sweet, I guess. But it's not much else. Before I talk about the movie itself, I want to talk about the packaging. And I suppose, in addition to that, because the packaging is related to this, it will require us to also talk about sort of what the discourse around Evangelion was, because that's almost more interesting. Same as Star Wars. It's almost more interesting to talk about the cultural discourse surrounding the film than it is to talk about the film itself. Evangelion 1.01, which is the home release of the theatrical version of the film. It's missing a few scenes, and it is much darker than 1.11. That's in terms of literal lighting. Like, it is more difficult to see what is happening. It has one of the weirdest covers. One of the weirdest covers I've ever seen. Probably the singular weirdest cover of any piece of Evangelion media. It's a rather photorealistic depiction of Evangelion Unit 1 towering over the city. And it's in this stark, high contrast black and red lighting. It reminds me a lot, and it's from about the same time period, so perhaps it's appropriate. It reminds me a lot of the Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Uncut Special Editions that Funimation released, not too far off from this time period. It's not the most inappropriate. It sort of has a sort of a, you know, like a kaiju tokusatsu sort of a vibe to it. And that's what Hideaki Anno, the director of these movies, is into. That's sort of his thing, you know. He's been doing Godzilla, working on Ultraman, I think. So it's not inappropriate necessarily, but it is weird, because no other piece of Evangelion media is really marketed in this way. The tagline of this DVD, the home version of the theatrical release, the rebuild of the original giant robot anime. What's interesting about that is if we look instead at the back of the Blu-ray of Evangelion 1.11, it instead says the rebuild of the groundbreaking giant robot anime. And that makes more sense. Evangelion is groundbreaking. It is influential, probably the single most influential anime of the decade in which it was released. But it is not original in any sense other than 1.01 was a remake of the original Evangelion. But that's not what they said. It was perhaps a bit of a mishandled wording, you know. Maybe it didn't quite communicate what they meant. But nobody really questioned it, you know. This was relatively early on. This came out when I was in middle school. And I'm a college flunky at this point. Evangelion, despite being pretty well accepted as just a genuinely good anime, today at least, was definitely for a time in that Toonami category, you know? Sort of new wave of boomers, you know? And that sort of Cowboy Bebop, you know, that kind of anime, where there was a time in the late 90s, early 2000s where anime was starting to get a little more normal to see in the West. It wasn't something you had to, go out of your way to look for. It wasn't something you had to, go to the shady VHS place to get your hands on. Or mail order through, catalogs. You could see it on cable TV now. And, there was a sort of micro-generation, I guess, of people who were introduced to anime. And because Evangelion is from about that period of time, it sort of is, or at least was at the time, viewed in the West as a sort of foundational part of the Mecha genre, which I'll get more into as we talk about the movie itself, but that's very much not the case. There isn't much about Evangelion that's particularly original at all, aside from just its execution, the way that it puts together the particular concepts that it does. But that's why I started with Evangelion 1.01. Well, I guess there's a couple reasons. That's the primary reason. The reason that it was the first that I watched was because it has this air of importance about it, or at least did at the time, in the popular discourse and in the marketing. And the reason that I watched it when I did, which was a good 5 years or so after it came out, was just because it was cheap, I bought this DVD when I was in high school, probably for less than $5 in a Right Stuff holiday sale. I figured, I'd like to check out Evangelion. I've heard that this is, it's sort of presented as the definitive version. And it's only a few bucks. Just throw it into the cart with some other stuff I'm buying. Why not? And I did like it. I liked it enough to, torrent the television series and the movie. And now I do own the Platinum Collection on DVD, which is still pretty much the only decent home release in the West of the series. There's a new release coming out soon on Blu-ray, but it's rather expensive. And they still failed to get the license for Fly Me to the Moon. the original ending theme of the television series. Let's talk about the movie now. I have a handful of notes here. I assume I don't need to get too deep into the story once again. I suppose I'll just, tell you, yeah, we're talking about spoilers. This isn't spoiler free. But does that matter? This is a nearly 15-year-old adaptation of a story that's nearly 25 years old. Like, if you don't know what this show is about yet, if you haven't seen this show, I don't know why you're watching my podcast about it. Don't quite know what's going on there. I guess the first thing that I noticed was Anno's direction. I've noticed that I guess what I've always liked about his direction mostly just comes down to the way that he paces, edits, and frames things. And I mean, he said this himself in interviews rather recently, I think even, is it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you can frame it, edit it a certain way, it can be entertaining. And yeah, that's really, I think, his main strength. And it's a good strength to have, but I think it's just about all there is to it, is just that he is good at not boring you. The pacing is surgical, cold, and it's not always clear what he's really trying to communicate through his direction. It's just, keep it entertaining above all else. Don't let the audience get bored. The movie is, of course, digital animation. There's some CG, not a ton, but it's there. This movie feels like it could have come out today, tomorrow. It's almost 15 years old. It's clean. It's pretty, but it's not terribly interesting. It's not timeless. It doesn't, I guess you could say, it doesn't transcend time the way that a timeless work of art would. It simply refused to exist within time in the first place. And I guess that goes more into sort of the presentation and the marketing, which I guess I didn't really talk about the cover of the Blu-ray version, but it's a particular scene from the movie, once again rendered in a relatively lifelike style. Sort of presenting it as it is a remake, which of course it is not. It's the first part of a 4-part film series that by the second movie has, pretty much completely changed course from the original series. But this first movie is pretty much a shot-for-shot remake, sort of presenting itself as the ideal, definitive version. But I think it lost a lot of character. I think that the original cell animation from the television series and from End of Evangelion, I just think, there's so much more character to it. Even to films that I don't like that much, like Royal Space Force, Wings of an AMEs. That movie isn't great. It has a lot of problems. But there's some fantastic moments in movies like that, where even if the overall package of it isn't perfect, there's moments that have so much more character than pretty much anything in this movie. What is Evangelion even about? What is Mecha about? I don't think I'm saying anything new here. You know, this is stuff that pretty much anyone who's talked about anime has said a little bit of in one regard or another, but, you know, a giant robot, a giant man, you know, it's like in Gundam, you know, the robot represents responsibility, specifically in terms of young men, you know, conscripted into the military, in terms of, you know, sort of when you fight in battle or anything else, you know, not anything else, but, you know, certain types of activities, you become alienated from yourself, you know. The real you is only controlling some larger apparatus, you know. And I think that that's really what, you know, Evangelion is about, and I think that's why, I think what it's remembered for is not that it, you know, did something entirely new by making a giant robot show about a kid who doesn't really want to pilot the robot, because again, Gundam already did that. But Gundam was very, very specifically about combat. And Evangelion is more generally about, like, I mean, it's about the division of labor, you know, which I think most half-decent coming-of-age stories are. It's about growing up and, you know, depending on who you are, you have a specialized expectation placed upon you by society. You know, and that's what it's all about, you know. And it's frustrating. Like, is the ultimate message of Evangelion not conform or die? Like, in the end, isn't that what it is? Know your place. In parts of the series, you see like, in the movies especially, it's even more so in the movies, like with the because now they can do it, you know, with CG. They can do it and have it be convincing. They can copy and paste the same 3D model of a tank infinitely. And you ask, who built these? Who built all these guns? Who built these buildings and these ridiculous contraptions? Half of humanity died. You know, isn't the world's population fucked? How are they getting all this work done? Like it's kind of weird, you know, like Shinji says at one point, you know, he says to Misato, like on the bridge overlooking the hospital or whatever, like, you know, oh, you guys, you just sit in your little bunker deep underground, safe and sound, while everyone else, you know, I'm up here doing the real work. And he's kind of right. You know, nerve agents are like this weird aristocracy in the world of Evangelion where, you know, normal people get like herded around from shelter to shelter, packed into these tight spaces. You know, and you have like these ridiculous things, you know, like how many electrical workers truck drivers, soldiers, who's driving those tanks? You know, even if a lot of the guns and things are automated, you know, who's running the trains? You see so many shots of this in this movie where there's so many people, and it's like, you know, it's obvious that the Evangelion is a symbol. I don't think necessarily that it should be interpreted as though the entire fate of the world does literally rest on Shinji. To a large degree, it doesn't. They can just have Rei do it, and they have virtually infinite Reys. They can just make more. And just, you know, I don't know. Everyone in this movie's stupid and annoying, and everything they do and say is contradictory. And of course, that's why everyone likes it, because it's realistic. That's what real life is like. That's what dealing with real people is like. It's all about, you know, everything in this movie. It's all obsessed with survival and the fate of humanity, you know. And I guess what I don't understand with all kinds of post-apocalyptic fiction, and this is post-apocalyptic. I mean, you know, you have the opening shots where you just see toppled buildings, you know, overturned cars in the streets and shit. Ridiculous overgrowth. The traffic lights aren't operating. At a certain point, you know, when you're just surviving at any cost, whether at the individual level or the sake of the species, such extreme costs of, you know, losing lives, spending labor, and the psychological toll on individuals, at what point is it really worth it? And of course, the answer lies in the Human Instrumentality Project, which I don't want to talk about too much in discussion of the first out of 4 movies. We'll get to that later, but, you know, the questions are there. And ultimately, how worthwhile the answers are depends on the future movies. And that's kind of the frustrating thing, is that as much, again, getting ahead of myself, because people mostly talk about this with the 3rd movie, but it applies to all of them. All of these movies are only as strong as the series ends up being in the end. And I want to make it clear at this moment, I have not watched all of the final movie. I've seen the first 40 minutes of it, and then my internet couldn't keep up with the stream. So keep in mind that I don't intend to have watched that movie until I talk about it, you know. Whatever my thoughts on it are, you'll be the first to hear them when part 4 of this gets uploaded. Shinji doesn't hesitate to punch Toji nearly as much as he does in the original, and that's probably the single most important change to his character in this movie. There's not very many changes, of course, you know. Most of the changes in this movie have nothing to do with the characters or the story. They're all just sort of technical details that'll be important for later films. Like, for example, probably the biggest thing, period, angels don't die. You know, in the TV series, they defeat the angels and they are dead. They leave a corpse. Maintenance men have to come and clean up the body parts. But in the movies, you know, they specifically say their AT fields are dispelled and they burst and turn into liquid, just like the humans did at the end of Evangelion. Which will be important for how impacts and attempts at instrumentality work in this continuity. It's all just technical changes. You know, like Just the way, and I don't know if it's accidental or if it was intentional. But of course, even if it was accidental, you know, like it is, like it's a reflection within the technology of the filmmaking process of just how life is now in economic and social relations. It's just that individual people don't matter anymore, you know? It all depends on how much they contribute or how much they're viewed to contribute to, you know, the superhuman organism, you know? The fetishization in the film of buildings, trains, artillery, the sheer productive scale, you know? Like I said, with the CG, you couldn't do detailed CG like that 25 years ago. Certainly not without a pretty significant budget, you know, like you could hypothetically do it, but no one was, you know, because of the productive scale that a movie like this takes. I don't know. It just kind of seems like, both in reality and in the context of the film, that humanity's survival just kind of, you know, people talk a lot today about things like ecofascism, you know, as like global warming gets worse, you know, we'll need more extreme, you know, controlling regimes to ensure humanity's survival. And like, yeah, even if it's not a hard necessity, I think that there is a certain point of desperation where most people will just, you know, give in to the whims of biopower, you know, where, yeah, it sucks. It sucks that people die. It sucks that we work hard, but we have to ensure survival at all cost. You know. But Shinji's struggle is ultimately that, you know, that sucks. That's not good. You know, like that's what makes Shinji relatable to some people and what makes him really annoying to others, you know, is that to someone, you know, to someone like me, I don't view a story like this as being like representative of the beauty of perseverance, you know. It's about, like, this is the real giving up, you know. It's a spiritual giving up. Just accepting a tortured existence, you know. And people say, you know, it's not about having what you want, it's about wanting what you have, but at a certain point, surely you can admit that what you have just fucking sucks, right? You know, like ultimately that's all that, that's the only thing that free will really means in the end, especially in these, you know, advanced societies with extremely, you know, limited social programming. As all that you have an opportunity to do is just decide that the role you've been given doesn't suck, you know. Everyone expects the world from Shinji, treats him like garbage, acts like they owe him nothing, and he can either learn to love it or die. He doesn't really have anything else. He can leave, he can run away, but what happens, you know? He gets tailed by fucking government agents. And the only thing he can do is meet a dead end in the road and say, okay, take me back. You know, just like in real life, people tell you you can go live in the woods, but you can't. There's no woods out there. You know, someone owns it. They'll kick you off. And even, you know, any patch of land any patch of land worth owning is owned. Anything someone doesn't claim to, you're not going to be able to survive on that place. Rey fully intends to die, right? In the end of the movie, you know, she tells Shinji, you know, goodbye. I'm out of here. I'm gonna protect you so that humanity can live on, but I'm not just willing, determined. She is determined to sacrifice herself to the point where she says goodbye. It will happen. Rey is literally, absolutely replaceable. You know? Just like everyone in the real world. You know? It's like, you know, I had people when I worked in retail say, you know, it doesn't matter who you are replaceable. Not to me, just sort of into the void, to everyone. You know? Even when I worked, you know, in mail, you know, the guys who'd been there for decades would say, you know, I mean, they didn't say it quite as eloquently as this, but the gist was, we don't need any of you. We do need all of you. Shinji is probably literally the only member of the main cast, besides maybe Gendo, who would give a single shit if Rey died. You know? All that anyone really cares about is survival. And a big part of that's probably because, you know, most of these people have lost enough, you know, anyone old enough to have remembered Second Impact rather, has probably, you know, lost enough that, you know, survival's basically the only thing they have, you know. And in a way, you know, Shinji is the only, you know, the younger people as the only people who can, you know, they're young enough, they haven't lived through an impact, they, you know, they haven't been beaten down so much. The way that they sort of value their own lives and experiences and wanting, you know, they want a good life, not just life at any cost, regardless of how shitty it is. Because of that, he's probably the only member, again, of the main cast who's really capable of caring whether any individual dies. And part of that is, too, you know, because he's in the position that he's in, ostensibly, again, as a member of the sort of nerve aristocracy, where, you know, someone like Toji probably doesn't feel the way he does because, you know, he's a normal person. He's being herded around from shelter to shelter like the rest of them. And that kind of seems, we'll get into it certainly more later, but with each iteration, ever since End of Evangelion even End of Evangelion, as much as it relies on the original series, of course, it changes enough contextually that the message it's trying to put across, because, I'm not necessarily of the opinion that Evangelion is high art or anything, or whether that even matters. But I think it is pretty undeniable that it is trying to say something. But what that is only gets muddier and muddier with each new installment. So it's difficult to say, obviously people, death of the author and all that, you can interpret whatever you want, but it's difficult to tell what are the people who made this movie trying to communicate versus just what is a viewpoint that exists within the world of the film. But it often seems like the point is Shinji's outlook of valuing quality of life, even of valuing the lives of individuals rather than, and individual experiences rather than just mere life itself, is childish. And that eventually, like Misato says, he's naive and complicated. You need to grow up and realize how simple it is, that you can't think about what ifs. You can't imagine greener grass. You just have to do what you have to. I think that that's going to be it for this one. I have other notes and things written down, but they're, basically they just boil down to, hey, that's interesting. Let's bring that up again when XYZ moment later in the series comes up. I might try to do one of these on a daily basis, so maybe by the end of the week we'll be through all of them. Comment, favorite, subscribe, like, or even dislike. Just show that you care in the boxes down there. But seriously, stay tuned for more fan service.